Welcome to the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival, one of the largest and oldest cultural arts events in Miami. We want to thank all our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all of you film lovers, of course, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support through all the years. My name is Rabbi Fred Klein. I'm the rabbi at the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. I've taught for the Melton program of SAGE and also direct Mishkan Miami, the Jewish Connection for Spiritual Support, a spiritual support program at the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, and run our Miami Board of Rabbis. Today, we are excited to be involved in a conversation about the movie that you just saw, which I'm sure impacted all of us in a very powerful and personal way. I want to introduce our director for this film, Jen Kaplan, who's with us today, as well as the subject of the documentary, the potter Steven Branfman. And we're going to be talking a little bit about this film and the takeaways that we can use in our own lives. So thank you all for joining us today. So I'd like to start with you, Jen. First of all, how did you get to know Steve? And how did you know about the exhibit that Steve was doing? And what was your own motivation to make this film? What was it about you that was gravitating? You're a documentary filmmaker. There are many subjects you could have done. What gravitated you to Steven's story?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Miami Jewish Film Festival for showing a father's Kaddish. And the way that I first was introduced to Steve and his exhibit was through a rabbi here who actually was in the film also, Rabbi Carl Perkins, who had called me on the phone and said, Jen, you've got to see this amazing exhibit of Chawans by Steve Branfman. And I had just actually gotten off the plane from Israel, and I said, okay, and I called Steve, and the exhibit was actually coming down in a couple of days, and amazingly, I was able to pull together a cinematographer, and we went off and filmed it. Now, when Steve and I spoke, he just said, I really just want to capture this. And so I sort of thought it was just going to be a one-day shoot day, and that was the end of it. And we interviewed him, and we filmed the exhibit. And before I left, I said, Steve, I think this is going to be a film. I don't think this is just a one day of shooting. And that's how it all started. So it was really something that I think we both felt and that we wanted to tell this story.
Is there something in your own life that influenced you that made Steven's story so compelling?
I don't think there was anything in my life personally. I think Steve is a very compelling person, and his story was very moving to me. And I just felt that I wanted to be able to tell that story. And I love the fact that there was art involved. And I feel like it was important. He was a special kind of person and still is. And I feel like that was really what drew me to wanting to be a part of this and tell this story.
Did you see, like, in terms of the film, as I mentioned, you can deal with many different subjects as documentary. Did you see creating this film as an act of memory for Jared? Did you see this as honoring Jared's life as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel that I was not blessed to know Jared before he died. But I think in learning about Steve's story and learning just about who Jared was as a person, this absolutely was a way to pay tribute to Jared. I mean, as you know, when the credits run, the first line is in memory of Jared Michael Branfman. And it was very important for me to sort of get that right and have it be meaningful to not only to Steve and his family, but to all the people who watched it as well.
I'm sure, like, going into, such a personal story of loss is very sensitive. And for you as a director, what do you think was the hardest part for you personally in terms of making a film like this?
Well, I shed a lot of tears interviewing Steve. And then watching some of the footage when I think the hardest part for me, and actually still is is when I saw Steve go back to Alfred University to pick up his son's belongings that he had left in the storage locker. And, you know, even in watching that footage again and again and again and seeing Steve's reaction, I sort of jump into his heart as well. And it was just, it's been brutal. I mean, you know, I didn't have to experience what Steve experienced, but however I could as another person, you know, it was a very touching moment and very difficult. And so I think just feeling all those feelings was hard for me, and also wanting to include more than I could include. You know, we originally had sort of a 45-minute film, and we cut it down to 30 minutes or so. And so a lot of those things were just, you know, as they say, on the cutting room floor. And that was really a hard piece because I wanted to incorporate and include those. But the people who were advising me said, you know, you have enough. But it was very hard in that way to sort of get through that.
So for example, those things that made it to the cutting room floor that you would have wanted to have shown that you thought were important. What, for example, give me an example of that.
So I think, you know, just more of the Fathers Forever group. You know, we had taped the, you know, entire evening that the men were together, and I had significantly more comments from them. And it was important to show it, but we couldn't include all of it. So at some point we had to sort of make our decisions and say, okay, you've got the nuggets, the essence, and some key points, and then we had to go to something else. So that's sort of one example of something that I think I would have included more of if it were just me making the decision alone.
I thought it was actually kind of interesting that you included that fathers group. But I think it really talks to the point of all of us who have lost somebody that we love in our lives. We don't get over it. We don't move on. We live with this in our lives. And one of the most poignant moments, I think, in the film is when one of the fathers who is now childless says, I'm still a father. I've never not seen myself as a father. I always have that within me. And having that kind of support group among other men coming together, which in itself is unusual because men have this, there's this image in our society that men are not supposed to display feelings. We're supposed to be stoic and strong. These are the expectations that are made. So actually having that men's group in the film, I think, gives permission to so many men in our community that when they need help, when they want community, that they should seek that. And I really respected the fact that you included that in our film. So Steven, as for you, like what made you agree to open up such a sensitive and painful chapter in your life for the entire world? What did you have any concerns when Jen approached you and asked you to make this documentary?
Oh, I didn't have any concerns. And making a film or even filming the exhibition, and then ultimately it becoming a documentary was not something that was on my mind at all. In fact, when I had the opening reception of the exhibition, our school videographers did film the exhibition. So we had a fair amount of footage just kind of as archival. And I never thought that I would ever use it for anything necessarily or go back to it. And in fact, I never even watched any of it until Jen started making A Father's Kaddish. So sharing the exhibition was important to me. And that was my intention, to have this exhibition, to share the 365 Kaddish Chawans, to share the circumstances that brought me to that place. And for me, that was going to be it. The exhibition was going to live on in an online presentation, but that was it. It wasn't until I met Jen that Jen came over with the videographer and filmed it, and then sat and interviewed me, did this whole notion of a documentary film come into play. And I had no hesitation, I had no qualms about it. And in fact, early on, during the production and during the filming, Jen invited me to watch what she had so far. And I immediately declined. And the reason she wanted me to watch it was out of respect for me as an artist and me as the subject of the film, and to have some creative input. And I said, Jen, I'm the subject of the film. You're the artist. I don't want to have any creative input whatsoever. And I didn't see any of it again until the director's rough cut last spring.
That's very interesting. One of the things I did want to explore, and I think in this way you're fortunate that both of you had a love for pottery. You know, when we memorialize someone, as we all say Kaddish, or you said Kaddish, but there was also something unique to both of you in terms of you both had this love for pottery as a language. And that's a great gift that you had maybe a similar soul in that way. So I wanted to ask you, what did pottery mean for both of you? And in particular, speaking about Jared, why a chawan? And just for our viewers, just remind us the chawan was the Japanese tea bowl that Jared perfected in the film.
Well, that's you just answered the question that, why a chawan? So there are two reasons for that. And the first one was that Jared was a clay artist. He was a student at the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University. And he was a student of the bowl. And we often, we take pottery forms for granted. And the bowl is probably one of the most ubiquitous ceramic objects that ever existed. Using a bowl for eating different kinds of things, for storage, for ritual, for all kinds of purposes. And Jared became a student of the bowl. And as simple and as unadorned as a bowl may seem, it's the single most difficult shape for a potter to perfect. And Jared perfected it as a student. And he perfected it to such a degree that his fellow students and his teachers would come to him to talk to him about the bowl and ask him about the bowls that he made. So that was kind of the introduction to the bowl. And the chawan, the Japanese tea bowl, was another bowl that Jared was devoted to. So when I went into the studio that day for some solace and for some relief, intending to make something, and then just couldn't, went home, and then came back again and just sat down spontaneously at my wheel to make something, it just, in some ways, subconsciously and unconsciously became a chawan. And that's what started me on the 365-day Father's Kaddish.
I'm sorry. No, I just wanted to sort of answer your question. I think that for me, what drew me was sort of the duality of the saying Kaddish, that Steve said Kaddish with his family in Shul, and he also said it by his hands creating a chawan every day. And I was very drawn to the fact that it was an art form that he was familiar with, and an art form that he knew, just kind of the visceral feeling of putting your hands in clay and creating something. And I think that there's a beauty to it. And I mean, it's calming, but as Steve and I talked, that there were so many different feelings that he had throughout the process of making those bowls. And I feel like that was just to use that word visceral, like you really can feel it as you're sinking your teeth into that clay. I mean, maybe they all were, maybe he smushed a few, I don't know, but it's just a whole feeling that you can direct emotions into the clay during that time. And I think I found that very, very powerful.
Another important and really personal thing about the chawan was that up until that point, I had made thousands of bowls. I mean, all kinds of other shapes too, but I had made thousands of bowls. But, and I knew what a chawan was, and I made bowls that I knew were being used in the Japanese tea ceremony, but I never intentionally made a chawan until that first one. And it was in some ways an enlightenment, in some ways an epiphany that I had now made the first bowl that I could confidently and emotionally call a chawan.
Hmm. You know, as I'm reflecting on this and the whole idea of creativity as a response to loss or grief and to creation of beauty in this world in a time when things seem so disoriented or broken, I'm thinking about, I had a friend who lost their son as well. And she was an artist and she did collage, and she did a whole series where there was a hole in the middle of every one of her pieces. And she did this, she had a whole series of these, and I looked at them and I realized like how in some ways the creative act can help us from the abyss of meaninglessness or the abyss of total uh, dissolution. And, you know, reflecting upon this, you know, I looked at your website, Steve, and it says like what your favorite part is the throwing of the clay is the first part. And I can imagine at that moment, there's only potential, right? And the least favorite part, he said, was the glazing. And I guess once the glazing, once the piece is put in the oven, it's done. It has no more, it can take no more form. It is what it is. It's become something out there. And you mentioned something in the documentary that for 10 years, these pieces were sitting in your studio. All 365 pieces were sitting in your studio on a shelf behind a veil of plastic, is the way you called it. And one day you woke up and you decided, you know, maybe it's time to glaze these and exhibit them. And in the last scene of the movie, I realized, and I went on the website, that these are even for sale now for you to share with the world. So what was that process? What did this mean for you to glaze these objects, to put them on display, and then to provide this for the world? What was that psychological process that you went through during that period?
I saw them every day, as I described in the film. They, as you just described, they were in the studio behind plastic, and having them behind plastic was not an emotional thing. That was a technical thing, just to keep them dust free. Because when you glaze a piece, if there's a layer of dust on it, the glaze won't stick, it won't fire right. So that was just a technical aspect. The veil was not anything that had to do with the pieces, with the making of the pieces or the meaning of the pieces themselves. And literally, I would see them every day and I would look at them, and sometimes I would pick one up or pick a couple up and examine it and put it back. And there was very little conversation between me and the work. And in your introduction, Rabbi, you used the word art as a language, and that is exactly what it is. You know, an artist speaks the language of their art, and the precise language is the media, and my media is clay, and I speak the language of clay. And then literally one day I went over to them, I picked one up, and it spoke to me, and it said, it's, you're ready. You're ready to do this now. And I did. And it was as simple and spontaneous as that.
You know, I think that you named the documentary, and this may be a question for both of you, A Father's Kaddish. And a lot of the film is about a very unique form of Kaddish, of 365 days of fashioning these chawans. But you also talked about your saying Kaddish for those 365 days. And I wanted to ask, how did your Jewish community, your synagogue, play a role in this process for you? And did you see strings of connection between that personal work that you were doing and the more collective work as a community saying Kaddish with one another?
Yeah, unquestionable. And the interesting thing here is when Jared passed away, we were no longer members of a synagogue. We hadn't been members of a synagogue since both of our children went to Hebrew high school after their bar mitzvahs for a couple of years. And we were looking for a place to say Kaddish, and we investigated a few of the synagogues in our area. One was Temple Aliyah, where Rabbi Perkins is the rabbi, and another was Temple Emmanuel. And it turned out that Temple Emmanuel had a minyan every day, every morning and every evening, without question. And that became the place where we went. And from the first day we went there, and we didn't know anybody there, we just went. And they just embraced us. They introduced themselves to us, the minyaneers and the ritual director and the rabbi who was there at the time. And we felt very comfortable. We felt very embraced there. And that became the place. And we became friends with a number of the minyaneers, and we still are, particularly the ritual director who was there at the time, and others there. And we said Kaddish, my wife, myself, and our son Adam, in the evening. And I made my Kaddish chawans usually in the morning. So my two practices of saying and doing Kaddish served as bookends to every day. And that's how they were connected. They were very different. They were very different practices. You say Kaddish in synagogue with a minyan, and my own personal Kaddish was purposely solitary. And they were very different, but they were connected in the fact that they were bookends for the day.
I just want to just reflect back, because I think that in the Jewish tradition, we have certain rituals that people are expected to do, whether that's sitting Shiva or whether that's saying Kaddish or lighting a yahrzeit candle. And yet, the meaning that people ascribe to these different rituals are filled in by each individual. Each journey is ultimately unique. And one of the things that, as a viewer of this documentary and as a chaplain, teaches me that we should never make assumptions of one's journey of grief. But that everybody who's saying Kaddish in a synagogue is going through their own unique journey. And even though those rituals, communal rituals, will help link us together or hold these feelings in a holding container, ultimately each journey is unique, and we need to listen to the unique journeys of each individuals.
If I could say something, Rabbi, just
Sure.
related to that, I really appreciate what you just said, and I think that also was an important component for me in making this film, was to show that there, as you said, there are different ways to grieve, and then that synagogue may not be the place for everyone, or something that someone does not want to go to every day, or even if they're going every day, it doesn't mean it's touching the heartstrings. They may be doing it out of obligation or a sense of community, but there are so many reasons that we can't begin to know. And I think by incorporating an art form or whatever it is, as the rabbi said in the film, journaling or reading special, authors, that for people, there are different paths to get through it. And Steve's was one way, and it was an art form. And I feel like that's true for a lot of people. And that if they have a modality that they can use to help them, and that's really what's the most important.
And if I can go back to the exhibition for a minute, Rabbi, the genesis of this whole project, culminating in the debut of the film, from my first entry back into the studio, the entire thing was a work in progress. There was never, I never thought, I never projected what the next day would be, would bring, would be like, or the next week, or the next month, or the next year, or the next 5 years. And in that light, each of the Kaddish chawans that I made was an individual, solitary act of creation, of speaking to the clay. And Kaddish chawan number one has no overt connection to Kaddish chawan number two, or number three, or number four, or so on and so forth. The one that I made that day was unique to that day, and that day was unique in that 365-day journey. And I had no thoughts about what I would ever do with these when I made them. I didn't think about when or how I would fire them or glaze them or anything. It was literally a work in progress, one step at a time. And then when I glazed them and fired them. And then I thought, now what am I going to do with them now? And my wife Ellen and I talked about it, and we both decided together that these were to be exhibited. And then when we were together formulating the plan for the exhibition, I had no idea what it was going to look like, how I was going to install it. I knew where I was going to have it, at the gallery at Thayer Academy where I teach and where Jared went to school. But I didn't know what it was going to look like until literally a few days before, and I began to formulate it. And then I didn't know exactly how I was going to install it until I was there with Ellen, and we were installing it together. And then while we were preparing for the installation, we talked about what would become of these after the exhibition. The exhibition was going to be on for a month. Then what? And then we decided together that we would sell them, and we would sell them for a few reasons. Number one, to share these with the world. And by sharing these with the world, we were sharing Jared's legacy and Jared's memory. And number two, we would take the proceeds and donate all the proceeds to the cancer fighting organizations that we were involved with at the time. And, perhaps number three was as another way for me to incorporate Jared's passing into my life.
In some ways, by providing other people these chawans, in some ways, did it mean for you sharing Jared with the world, his legacy with the world as well?
Yep. Yeah.
Rabbi Perkins said something really interesting in the documentary, which is the work of grieving, reconstructing shattered memory. And that image of work of grieving really resonated in this documentary for me. That grieving is hard work, whether it's saying Kaddish every day or every day sitting down and carving a chawan. It's the same act every day, but as you mentioned, Steve, every day was a unique experience. But there was always, you mentioned in the documentary, every day you were going to make one. And it didn't matter, maybe one day you felt that I can't do it now, but then you went ahead and you did it anyway. And that kind of work, it takes courage, I think. It takes a lot of courage to do this, to yield some form of beauty and meaning from devastating loss. So I guess I want to conclude our conversation with a question for both of you, because I think that people watching this film may either have recent loss or even years ago, because one of the things that we know about losing loved ones is we don't get over it, we live with in light of this loss. And so what do you hope, both of you, that people who are watching this will take away from this film for their own lives?
You go, Jen.
Yeah, so I think that to me, I sort of feel like hope is the most important thing. We've been needing a lot of it lately in the past year for sure. But I think throughout history and throughout our personal lives, and knowing there are multiple ways to grieve is something that I think is important. I think this is sort of one of these things that you have to look outside the box and see, oh, I could do art, or I could, take a walk, or I could hike the Appalachian Trail. I mean, I don't know. There are many ways that people can decide to sort of get through it, if you will, in a certain time period. And as you said, Rabbi, that there's no getting over it. You incorporate it in your life in whatever way you can. But I feel like at the end of the day, that hope is the most important thing. And I do want to touch on something that you said just a minute ago about courage. And I really feel like Steve allowing us to film his story, it's not even so much his work, but that he was opening his heart to us as the crew and to the world who, hopefully will see this film, is really what is both encouraging and provided a tremendous amount of courage to do that. And so I feel very grateful for that. But again, at the end of the day, it's about what kind of hope you can bring to people's lives.
Well, I'll say also that, one more important thing about the making of the Chawans is that they were the only pots that I made for the entire year. And I never missed a day, as Jen just alluded to. I never missed a day, no matter where I was. And there were times during that year that I had to travel for work or to teach a class somewhere else, somewhere in the country. And if I knew a potter in the area when I was traveling, not for work, I would ask them if I can come into their studio and use their studio. Or if it was a hotel room, I knew that I had to bring clay with me and fashion a chawan not on the wheel in my hotel room. So I never missed a day. They were the only pots that I made for the entire year. And my goal for the film is similar to Jen's, and it's certainly ironic that the film has debuted during COVID, talking about grief and talking about processing grief and loss and finding a way to channel what has happened into a way that you are able to incorporate it into your life. And that's what my goal is, for this film, to share how I navigated through this and continue to, and if it can suggest ways for other people to do it, as Jen says, hike the Appalachian Trail, go kayaking, ski your favorite ski run 300 times, 365 times, ride a bike, which I do. There are many different ways that we can channel our grief and come out, if not stronger at the other end, resolved and comforted and satisfied in some way.
I think that in concluding, I think we live in a society in which people are told it's time to move on, or people aren't given the permission to grieve the way that they need to grieve. And I think that what you both created for all of us, and as you mentioned, Steve, especially now with COVID all around us, it gives us the permission to feel what we feel, but also to give us a pathway to think about ourselves and our personalities and our loves and our deep sense of who we are, and to use that in ways to create beauty from loss. And that's something that I think we all can take with us during these days. So I'd like to thank both of you for joining us at this film festival and joining me in conversation. And I wish all of you well, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
My honor.